They laughed when they first heard the claim. It was not a mean laugh, more the reflex of people who had been taught a story their whole lives, a story of industry and honor that left no room for surprise. In the dim barracks, a cluster of men joked and nudged one another as Lieutenant Nakamura read the pamphlet. "They build like factories of legend," Sergeant Tanaka scoffed. "Listen to this," Private Saito said, laughing. "One airplane every hour, they say." "Nonsense," murmured Corporal Ito, tapping ash from a cigarette and smiling. "Propaganda." "You believe that, Nakamura?" asked Private Suzuki, eyebrows raised. "Do you think the Americans lied about food and medicine and the rest?" Nakamura shrugged, a short breath that smelled faintly of oil and tobacco. "I do not know. I only know what I have seen." Mr. Yamamoto, the interpreter who had been captured months earlier and now stood by out of habit, folded his hands and said softly, "We will go. They invited you to see." The banter kept going, voices low but quick as footsteps, 10 little exchanges circling disbelief until the air itself seemed to wait. 2 sensory notes threaded the scene, the smell of boiled rice and metal soap from a chipped basin, and the scrape of boots on wooden boards that sounded like the beginning of a march. They were told to pack lightly, to board a bus that would take them beyond the known map. The ride smelled of diesel and old wool, the engine thrumming under the floor as if the vehicle had a pulse. Outside the windows, rice paddies swept by like green mirrors, and children waved bright hands. The air tasted of river mud and drying straw. Captain Roberts introduced himself early in the morning with a line of neat words and a clipboard, his voice thin over the motor noise. "You will see what we mean." Engineer Walter Stone, who would guide the tour, sat 2 seats ahead and kept fingers tracing the seam of a leather notebook, a faint metallic tang on his breath, as if welded steel clung to his shirt. Conversation on the bus was a string of questions that hung and were not answered until the factory gates appeared, high and suddenly close, a wall of brick that seemed to swallow sound and spit back an expectation. The scent changed before the gates opened, a sharp, hot smell of oil, a sweet metallic shimmer, and the low, tidal throb of engines starting somewhere beyond sight. When the gate swung wide, the first strike hit them in the chest. Sound like a distant thunder that was actually hundreds of hammers and presses, a percussion that made cups tremble, a roar with a rhythm as precise as breath. The men stepped down onto concrete that smelled of grease and baking tar, their shoes echoing hollow and new. The space unfolded like a sea made of metal and glass, rows upon rows of stations, a river of movement where machines coughed out parts and hands assembled them as if choreographed. Private Saito put his hand to his mouth, the skin of his palm catching the dust. "This is bigger than any dock I saw." Corporal Ito blinked until his eyes watered from the bright indoor light and the metallic dust. "It hurts the eyes," he said in a tone that was half wonder, half fear. The interpreter, Mr. Yamamoto, stepped forward and translated Captain Roberts' voice, which was steady and low. "We wanted you to see with your own eyes." The silence that followed was a kind of speech, the men listening to the building itself speak in clanks and sighs. They walked deeper, and the scale revealed itself in ways numbers could not first. The ceiling lost itself in a haze of heat and light. Then the line of products slid past like a river of finished promise and promise not yet finished. The main hall was a cathedral of productivity, an endless assembly where components merged into shapes that meant power. The sight of 20 technicians lifting a wing into place in perfect unison made Lieutenant Nakamura stop, a small sound like a catch in his throat. Maria Flores, a forewoman with grease on her forearms and a braid tucked under a cap, called across the line, and her voice carried, a human note inside the machine chorus. "Careful, Joe! Steady! Lift!" Joe Turner, a mechanic with oil under his fingernails, answered with a grunt that became almost musical. "Got it, Maria." Harold Briggs, the floor supervisor, walked past with a checklist and a glance that measured time as if it were another raw material, his shoes hitting the floor in metronome. The air tasted of hot iron and lacquer and the faint sweetness of worn leather belts. Fingers brushed metal and felt the subtle warmth of friction. The men noticed the cadence more than the layout, the same hands at the same tasks, creating a confidence that was contagious and frightening. "How many?" whispered Private Suzuki. "How many can they do?" Nakamura pulled out a small scrap of paper and a stub of pencil and began to make the first ugly calculation in front of them, the movement slow and deliberate like a ritual. They were shown the process piece by piece, the jig that held parts in place, the tool that pressed a rivet, the conveyor that moved assemblies forward at a measured pace. Walter Stone explained with simple sentences and a patient tone, so that the math that hid behind each motion would be visible. "This station finishes a fuselage section every hour," he said, voice low but precise. "This crew works 2 shifts, 5 days a week. The factory has 3 of these lines." The interpreter repeated, and the men tried to picture it, turning the words into images with their eyes. The air smelled of sweat and oil. Hands felt the vibration of a nearby press, and the bright overhead lights left a metallic aftertaste on the tongue. A short exchange followed between Nakamura and Stone. 8 quick replies as they tried to translate method into meaning. "But how many in a day?" Nakamura asked, pencil tapping. "We calculate," Stone said, 63 an average of each major plant." 63 a day, Suzuki repeated, each syllable a stone dropped into a still pond. The sound of machines continued like background prayer. The faces in the crowd were not the faces the men had imagined to be responsible for such output. They were mothers, fathers, immigrants who had learned tricks of hands and timing. Names now emerged as they spoke. Maria Flores wiping her palms, Joe Turner rubbing his fingers, Harold Briggs checking a gauge, Luis Ortega from maintenance pointing out a loose bolt, and Helen Park adjusting a rivet gun with a practiced twist. Each name landed with a detail, a laugh, a habit that contradicted stereotype. The work smelled of lunch pouches and grease. Hands were scarred and steady. Voices traded short jokes. "You think we are simple," Maria said to a nearby translator, "but we make time into things." The diversity surprised and humbled the visitors in equal measure. Then came the math, the part that reworked pride into calculation. Nakamura wrote as the numbers tumbled from the mouths of the hosts and his own memory. 63 minutes per aircraft, multiplied by 24, multiplied by 3 plants, multiplied by months of uninterrupted work. The men around him fell into a hush that let only counting breathe. "If they keep this pace," Mr. Yamamoto said, "one plant makes nearly 500 in a month." 500, Tanaka echoed, fingers pressing into the wood of a crate until the knuckles whitened. 500 planes in 1 month, Suzuki said, his voice cracking like glass. The simple sum multiplied into years, and the totals grew into a landscape where production swallowed time. "When you add logistics and parts and more factories," Stone said, "the number becomes something else. It becomes a force." Their faces shifted as if a light had been turned on in a basement and they could see pipes that had always been there. A fever of whispered questions rose up, and then a bitter clarity. The calculation changed the story they had told themselves since boyhood. At roughly the point when the calculation settled like dust, the host paused, and we asked you to pause too, because we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments what line of the factory surprised you most. Start your answer with the phrase, "What shocked me most was," and then name the detail. Did the sound, the smell, the names of the workers, or the simple number make you rethink a story you thought you knew? Share the person who stood out to you,
Maria Flores, Joe Turner, Harold Briggs, or someone else, and tell us why. Your comment matters, because this story is built from yours.
The memories of real people and from numbers that we can check and recheck. Your perspective helps others see angles we miss and often guides our next steps in research. We read every thoughtful reply, and sometimes a comment points us to a new document or a photograph that changes the narrative. So write what you felt and why, and help the community dig deeper. Now back to the story to see what the math did to those who had believed otherwise. The realization that leaders had known these capacities and had kept their own counsel felt like a betrayal to some. In the mess hall that night, arguments broke out, voices rough and raw. Lieutenant Nakamura confronted an officer who had returned from long duty. "Why were we kept from knowing?" he demanded. "Did they use us as shields?" The officer's face tightened, and his reply was a brittle string of explanations that did not satisfy. 8 to 10 exchanges of accusation and excuse filling the room. Tears came for some, like Private Saito, who sat with his head in his hands as if he could hold the number there and not let it turn into grief. The smell in that room was of cold tea and old uniforms, the taste of stale bread, the feel of wood tables worn smooth by decades of hands. Betrayal had a texture. It pressed at the chest like a fist. Some men turned their anger outward toward those far above. Others turned it inward, wondering what belief had allowed them to ignore the clues all along. In the end, they left the factory changed. They returned to the camp with quieter steps and a new ledger in their minds. The calculations stuck there like a bone, simple and immovable. One plane every 63 minutes, multiplied over months and years, reconfiguring what victory, loss, and strategy meant to them. Captain Roberts shook hands. Maria Flores waved. Joe Turner grinned. And Harold Briggs lifted a small salute as the bus pulled away. But the men inside watched a machinery of production and power that had once been invisible. The lesson that remained was cold and practical, that power is often manufactured long before it meets the battlefield, and that information withheld can be another kind of weapon. If this account shifted how you see history, share it with someone who might still believe the old story. If you want more investigations that bring numbers and testimony together, subscribe to our channel and join the conversation. Memory and measurement together keep the past honest, and sometimes that truth arrives in the sound of a factory that will not stop humming.